Hello, hello, and welcome to this bonus episode of Podcasting for Educators. In the last two episodes 18 and 19, I've been focusing all on having guests onto your podcast. And so in episode 18, I talked all about the benefits of having guests on your show, how to set up a scheduling system, and tips on where to find great fit guests. And in episode 19, I discussed 7 tips for preparing your guests and for the actual interview. So if you haven't listened to those episodes, go ahead and take a listen to those first. As I was getting those episodes ready, I realized that there was one more thing that I really wanted to cover. And that is, what in the world do you do if you have an interview with a guest, it doesn't go the way you wanted it to go, and you really don't want to air it? Awkward. No, but really, it can be really awkward and really tough to navigate. This is a tough question, and it's one that I've had to deal with for my clients before, and it's a question that I get a lot from people. So I am going to give you my best advice on how to deal with this in today's episode. Before we get to that, I want to just remind you that you can download a free guest guide at podcastingforeducators.com/guest guide. And you can go in, it's a Canva template. You can go in and you can edit it to have your branding colors, any kind of photos that you want in there. And it's just a really quick one-page list of tips that you can send to your guests when they schedule an interview. And it gives them ideas on how to prepare for the interview, where they should record, what kind of technology they need, what kind of equipment they need, and how to get the best audio possible. So if you have not already grabbed that, you can do that again at podcastingforeducators.com/guest guide. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to Podcasting for Educators, the podcast that helps TPT authors and other online educators launch and grow their show. I'm Sarah, former elementary school teacher turned podcast manager, and I'm on a mission to help you get your podcast out and into the ears of those who need it most. Busy teachers, counselors, literacy specialists, SLPs, parents, and everyone in between. Each week, we'll cover quick tips, strategies, and podcast industry updates so that you can be on top of your podcasting game and gain some new customers along the way. Are you ready? Let's get to it. Inviting guests onto your show and recording interviews are one of the most fun parts of podcasting. You get to connect with new people and bring new value to your audience through your guests. But every now and then, things don't always go as planned. You may push the stop recording button at the end of the interview, say goodbye to your guest, and think, oh my gosh, how can I possibly put this out to my audience? And real quick PSA, because I don't want to scare you, this really doesn't happen very often. But when it does, there's a few reasons for it. It might be because of really bad internet connection throughout the interview, or maybe your guest is extremely soft-spoken, or maybe you just had kind of like an awkward rapport and there was lots of silence throughout the interview and you just didn't really feel like the conversation flowed very well. Maybe your guest went completely off track and you don't feel like the episode is going to bring any kind of value to your listeners. Or maybe you didn't really agree with the guest's perspective on something, and it totally goes against what you usually teach on your podcast and in your business. If you find yourself in one of these situations, whatever the reason is, remember first that you are the host and you need to always have your audience in mind. I know that I say this all the time, but it really is true. So the first thing you can do is go through the interview, kind of skim through it, listen back to it, and consider whether or not it can be saved with really close editing. So back to that possibility of maybe there was a lot of awkward pauses and it wasn't flowing for whatever reason. Any kind of big gaps in the conversation, that can easily be fixed with editing by closing up those gaps of silence. But if it's not salvageable, let's look at a few different things that you can do. This has especially been on my mind a lot lately because of a conference that I attended a few months ago. I've talked about this conference a few times on the podcast, but it was a conference for podcasters and podcast service providers. And one of the sessions that I went to, there was a panel of really experienced podcasters, people who have been doing this for years. One woman had even had her podcast for 15 years. And somebody in the audience, they were doing a Q&A, and somebody in the audience asked, what do you do if you have an interview that really didn't go well and you don't want to air it? And I was shocked at what the panel said as their answer. And everybody that was with me was also shocked. Their answer to this problem was, you don't say anything at all. Basically, just ghost them. And I don't really agree with that. I don't really think that that's the best approach. And I think that there are other options out there, even if it does feel uncomfortable to you. I think you need to say something. But what? Well, number one, if it's a tech issue, some sort of internet issue where it's really glitchy throughout the interview and it's just really bad quality, that's a really easy out. You just let your guests know that you had really poor internet connection. And if you want to re-record with them, if it's an interview that you think is really great, it was just the internet that was the problem, then you can ask them to re-record. And kind of a quick note on this, on the whole idea of having internet issues during an interview. If you feel like something is off during your interview, like something's off with your guest equipment, with the internet connection, maybe you hear an echo in your headphones, you're probably right. There probably is something wrong. Again, it could be an echo. It could be like a cable that's twisted and making some weird kind of noise. Maybe your guest has loose jewelry on, like bracelets, and it's just jingling throughout the whole interview. If any of these kinds of things are happening and in the back of your mind, like that little voice is telling you, something doesn't sound right, or there's distracting noises, but I don't want to be rude, I don't want to stop them mid-sentence, you need to stop and you need to kind of restart. If it's an internet issue or a tech issue, I would go ahead and log off, restart your session, or reschedule for another day. That's way better than going through an entire interview and then having to re-record and go through like that whole scheduling process again. So just a quick note, if you feel like something's off during the interview, chances are you're probably right. Follow your gut. Okay, so that kind of solves the tech issue. Simply re-record if you want to. Now, if the reason for not wanting to air the interview has to do with any kind of awkwardness or lack of value, this is where it gets a little bit tougher. In my mind, you kind of have three main options here. The first one is, like the panelist said at the conference that I attended, you either don't say anything and cross your fingers that they never bring it up to you. I'm just throwing that option out there because people do it all the time. So take it with a grain of salt. It is an option. Number two, you say something to your guest that's not a lie, but it's not as blunt and harsh. So you could say something to your guest like, unfortunately, we won't be able to fit this interview into our content schedule right now. Or, a little bit more honest, you don't feel like the interview is something that your audience needs at this time, but you're going to keep the episode in your bank, and when you feel like it's an appropriate time, you might air it. Again, we're getting a little uncomfortable here. I know that these kinds of conversations are hard. And then a third option is to just be super honest and let them know exactly why you won't be able to air it. Maybe, again, that example of maybe they talked a lot about a teaching philosophy that you just don't agree with. You don't believe in it. You can be honest about that and you can tell them, hey, this doesn't really align with what I teach. Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for taking the time to be a guest, but unfortunately, we won't be able to air the interview. So ultimately, you have to decide what you feel most comfortable with, but that gives you a few options to have in the back of your mind, play around with, tweak so that it fits what feels best to you. And then again, this is just why it's so important to really do some research on a guest, especially if it's somebody that you've never met before. 99% of the time, these interviews turn out amazing. But it is important to do some research on this person, whether you're asking them to be on your show or maybe they've pitched themselves to you as a guest on your show. Check them out. Take 10 minutes. Look at their social media. If they have a podcast, listen to their podcast. If they've been a guest on a podcast, listen to that episode, even if it's only a little bit. But do a little bit of research, get a feel for who they are, what they speak on, and just take the time to make sure that it really is a good fit for your show. Again, this does not happen often. I really want to emphasize that, but it's good to be prepared if it does. And if you are ever faced with this situation, because it can be uncomfortable, and you need to bounce some ideas off of someone and get someone's opinion on how to best deal with it, you can always send me a DM on Instagram. I'm at Podcasting for Educators on Instagram, and I'm always happy to talk it through with you guys. Every situation is unique, and so sometimes you just need somebody to be a soundboard for you. Okay, last reminder to go download that guest guide freebie that you can send your guests to help them be prepared for your interview. Again, that's podcastingforeducators.com/guest guide. I have got a great guest episode coming up for you next week. I can't wait, and I'll talk to you then. If you have any questions or takeaways from this episode, send me a message on Instagram at Podcasting for Educators. I'd love to hear from you. All links and resources mentioned can be found in the show notes at podcastingforeducators.com. Thanks so much for tuning in today. Bye for now.